our guest lecture sessions. The first guest lecture session, it was really wonderful, and we have a lot of beneficial, about knowledge about qualitative research from pre-surface chemistry teacher. And today we have a new topic. It is about qualitative research methods. So I think we can start now. Dr. Aisling Oboy, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, so first of all, just to say, brilliant to see you. I hope I see some familiar faces from last Thursday. So I hope so. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining me again. Thank you again, Dr. Venny, for inviting me to meet with you and to participate in these really important sessions. And so thank you very much indeed for those. Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen, so please bear with me as I do that. Sorry, please bear with me 1 second. It's not the technology, it's me. It's me. There we go. I think that's it. No, hang on. Yeah, I hope so. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. And I'll just move it to slideshow. Can you see that all right? Venny, is that okay?
Yes, it's
Perfect.
very clear.
Thank you very much. Okay, so just a reminder, hello. Thank you for the introduction. And if you attended last week's session, you can feel free to wave or send a chat message. I'm very delighted to have your participation again. Okay, so as Dr. Venny said, this is the second of our 3-part series. So in this session, we'll be looking at some detail on qualitative research methods, how it's conducted, common data collection methods used in qualitative research. And we'll also look at some of the advantages and some of the challenges. I prefer to think of them as challenges rather than disadvantages, just because it makes us think about creatively about ways that we can address challenges. Okay. Also today, I want to have a bit of a closer look at how we can analyze qualitative data. For those of you who attended last week, I'm going to draw on some of the same papers that you are familiar with from last week. And for anyone who's new, don't worry, we will take you along with us. That's no problem at all. Okay. All right, so just a very brief recap. So last week, I think it was the 15th, I can't remember the last day that we met. So a very brief recap. I think I know that we had talked about these particular concepts, about differences between quality and quantity. And we talked about quality as being descriptive, something you can feel, something you can experience, and quantity being basically about counting things, how many and amounts. We looked at the story of Miss Jones. If you remember, Miss Jones was the science teacher who was curious, like all science teachers are. She was curious about why her students perhaps weren't performing or learning as she had anticipated that they would. And we looked at the different questions, research questions, that Miss Jones might ask from a qualitative research perspective and then from a quantitative research perspective. And so we focused then on the qualitative, so Miss Jones as the qualitative researcher. And one of the things that I encouraged you to think about was about thinking about qualitative research as understanding how people interpret their own experiences, about how they construct and make sense of the worlds that they live in, and the kinds of meanings that participants, that people attribute to their experiences. Was it good or bad? So when the teacher was asking questions in the classroom, did it help me learn? Did it not help me learn? Did I feel good about that? Did I not feel good about that? Those are the kinds of things, the kinds of quality that we want to understand better. And that's why we conduct qualitative research. One of the questions that I asked you to consider, and I would invite you now, it was a little bit of homework. Don't worry, there's no punishment of any kind if there is no homework. But one of the things I wanted you to think about was, in your role as a pre-service teacher, chemistry teacher, why do you need to know about qualitative research? That was one of the questions that I had suggested you might be interested in. You might want to think about. Did anybody come up with any reasons? Please feel free to either just unmute and talk, or if you want to type into the chat, that's okay. So why do pre-service teachers need to know about qualitative research? Anyone? Oh, Dr. Venny, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Is it clear now, Dr. Aisling?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, let me translate that into Indonesian. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian atau adik-adik sekalian, Ibu Aisling menanyakan mengapa mahasiswa FKIP Kimia perlu tahu tentang penelitian kualitatif. Oke, ada yang ingin menjawab, silakan pakai bahasa Indonesia boleh, di chat juga boleh. Kenapa sih mahasiswa kimia atau dosen kimia atau kita itu butuh tahu tentang penelitian kualitatif? Silakan, siapa yang mau jawab, Bapak Ibu sekalian? Silakan di unmute. Maybe this is not warm up.
No problem at all. Yeah.
Someone wants to say something. Ibu Aisling, Pak Judianto Sirait, did you say something?
Okay, thank you, Bu Feni. Thank you, Dr. Aisling. I think as pre-service teachers, they need to know about the process of students learning, probably in the classroom, and how they solve the problem, for example, and how they explain a concept and to the teacher. So it's not only about the score. If you talk about the quantitative study or research, it's about the number. For example, the student got 80, 75%, and then for qualitative research, we want to know about how they got 75, how the process got 75, and how they explain, they understand a concept, for example. I think,
yeah, completely agree with that. Joe, is it Joe? Thank you. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, Hoye. Thank you, Hoye. No, that's
no, Joe. Yeah, Joe actually.
Joe or Hoye.
Sorry.
You tell me, please. You tell me. So, absolutely. Perfect example there. We can understand something about a score that says 75%, for example, but what about the hows and the whys around that? Absolutely, yes. And I think all teachers, no matter what we teach, we are talking about working with human beings. We are talking about social interaction. We are talking about human development, and those things need us to understand the quality. So we talked about last week about the quality. We need to understand those experiences and meaning that we have as well. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you for your participation. If anybody wants to pop into the chat a message, feel free at any point. I'm very happy to engage with those as well. Brilliant. Okay. What I would like to do that, to move on to now is to look a little bit about what we're going to do today. I've put a series of clocks along here only because we might be going a little bit faster than we did last week. But if there is anything that you think that you want to check, that you want to say, Aisling, please slow down, or there's something that I don't understand, please just let me know. Okay, please either just unmute or put your message in the chat. All right. So these are some of the things that we're going to do today. Understand the ways in which qualitative research is conducted, common data collection methods, advantages and challenges, and then also ways that we can look at some of the detail on qualitative data analysis. Okay, this is quite a slide with a lot of information here. And my purpose is that, so when you are reading through these, lost where I am here. Okay, so when you are reading through the slides and the PowerPoints later on, you can go back over and you can read again. And also I'm pointing you to some sources of reading that you can access. These are ones that I'm familiar with. You will, and your lecturers and your professors will know others as well, and that's great. Okay, I'm not suggesting that this is the best one in the world ever. That's not what I'm suggesting. This is one that I'm familiar with. This is one that I think has been very useful for me as a researcher. It's been very useful for my master's students. It's been useful for my doctoral students. But please, you know, I don't own this book. I get no no good things happen because I recommend this book. I just recommend it because I've used it and I think it's useful. But remember, it's not the book, it's one book. Okay, and so it's good to expand and to read other references in relation to research methods and in education. One of the reasons why I suggest this, or would recommend this, is that it does cover both qualitative and quantitative work. Okay, and so it's if you had one book or a book that you wanted to look at for different kinds of research, this is one of those books. There are, of course, books that are specifically about qualitative research, and I have some of those on the reference lists as well, if it's an area that you want to pursue in more depth. Okay, so what I've put out here are some of the ways in which we can undertake qualitative research. And I use this, the ways, the approach, it's how we start to do things. These are some, this is not a final list. Okay, so these are just some of the common ways of undertaking qualitative research in an educational context. So one of the ways that we can undertake qualitative research is through naturalistic and ethnographic methods. And why am I talking about this? Well, last week we looked at some classroom data, classroom interaction. And that's what we might call naturalistic data. So it was capturing what actually happens in real life. It's not what someone says happens in real life. It's trying to capture what actually happens in real life. And so that's naturalistic inquiry, very often associated with ethnographic work. Why is it called ethnographic work? Well, there's very much a focus on the context. So the immediate situation surrounding the naturalistic environment, the relationships between people operating and interacting in that environment, as a way to help us better understand what it is that we are investigating. So if we are investigating learning from a naturalistic approach, learning in the chemistry classroom from a naturalistic approach, we would go into a chemistry classroom and we would try to capture what actually happens in real life as it's happening. Another way that we can conduct qualitative research is moving slightly away from a naturalistic approach of investigating an environment and how people interact and behave and work with one another and build relationships with one another. Another way to investigate or to undertake qualitative research is through more documentary research. And that's very much putting quite a bit of distance between you as the researcher and, if you like, the object, the phenomenon of your study. Documentary research is used a lot in education because people want to investigate the written artifacts that we use every day in our classrooms, whether it's lesson plans, textbooks, curricula, the guidance that we have for teachers. So, the teacher's book. So we've got our textbook, and then there's the teacher's book that tells us how to do things. We might want to investigate those. We might want to see what is the guidance that teachers are given. We might want to make an assessment of how useful, how detailed, how important that guidance is. We might also want to take a look at policy documentation. So different ministries of education, different departments of education may produce documents which are supposed to support teaching or to develop new initiatives. And as researchers, we might have questions, research questions, that can be best answered through a documentary, through researching documents. So I just want to show you what the range is here. Increasingly, and you and I both know that over the last few years, the idea of internet-based research or online life has really come to the fore. Conducting research online is now much more frequent than it was, as we know, before the global pandemic, before COVID-19. It had always been there. People were always doing research either on or through internet-based interaction and methods, but increasingly we see this becoming absolutely part of our normal set of practices. And of course, when we think about internet-based research, we can think about participants and researchers being in completely different places. Like, you and I are in completely different places, but we're able to share this teaching and learning environment through, computer media communication, through technology. So research conducted through an internet-based research, computer-mediated research, online research, offers us different ways of conducting research. Just some examples I've given here is the online synchronous interview. So in a way, the online version is kind of just trying to replace the normal face-to-face, or rather the traditional face-to-face. But we do have other options available to be able to connect with people, to ask questions, to get their experiences. Another example I've given here is through asynchronous chat. We've got our WhatsApp messages. When we might be using those to communicate with each other. We may not be both paying attention at the same time. There may be a delay, but we can also use, and increasingly that is a form of communication that's being used to conduct research. Another approach to conducting qualitative research is through a case study. And I'm sure you're all scientists, so you are chemistry teachers, so you know about conducting research and looking at particular cases, particular instances that you want to examine in depth. Okay, and case studies. You could have a case study of one learner. You could have a case study of a class. You could have a case study of one teacher. You could have a case study of 6 or 7 teachers. That's something we looked at last week about how many is enough for qualitative research, and we had that discussion. But for a case study, the focus is very much on what we have defined as the case. So your focus, your attention is almost exclusively on the case. That is at the center. And as I say, that whatever that case is, it can vary from one individual to class, to a teacher, to a school. Action research, I think it's very important for us to mention action research. We are teachers, and therefore a lot of work that is conducted in educational contexts is action research based. Now, action research could be qualitative, could be quantitative. Okay, just being really clear about that. But the focus for action research is on change. And as teachers, I think that's what we're always wanting to know: how to improve, how to enable all of the students in the class to get the top marks, not just the one person at 75%. How do we get really good teaching? How do we get really good learning to happen? So it's about change. And part of that action research is a cyclical process. So very often when you read more about action research, you will see diagrams. Very often it's a circle, it's a cycle. And the first part of that is about planning. So you plan what it is that you want to do, you act, so you implement your plan, you observe the impact of your plan, and you reflect upon why it worked or why it didn't work. And then that can lead you back again into another plan and another set of actions and another set of observations and another set of reflections. So it's very much about a cycle. So I just want, and I think it's important for you to think about the different approaches to undertaking qualitative research. Okay. All right. Am I okay to go ahead, or does anybody have any questions or any comments?
Ada yang ingin bertanya atau ada yang ingin memberikan komentar sejauh ini?
Hello.
Oh yeah. Oh,
Hello.
Hello, Bu Didi. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Fanny. Hi, Dr. Alboyle. How are you?
Hello. I'm good. Thank you very much.
Well, Ibu Aisling, I have some questions. Would you mind answering, or we just go ahead?
No, please go ahead. Any questions are totally fine. I'll try my best to answer them.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, what? So you've mentioned like 5 types of qualitative research, according to the source of the books mentioned in 2007. So what do you think the condition is supposed to be included in this these types? Or maybe it's different perspective. I mean, maybe because different authors have different perspectives, they have different categories in classifying the qualitative research, the kinds of qualitative research. So for example, so we have internet-based research, that is recruiting, conducting research online. Example like synchronous interviews and asynchronous. How about we have the actual interviews and this actual chat with some particular participants, like we observe their activities. For example, say that we have 4 participants of our research, 1 teacher and 3 students, for example. Then we observe their teaching learning process in the class, and also we interview them. So what do you classify here in the qualitative? Of course, it is a qualitative research, right? But in what type of qualitative research it is included? Yes.
Brilliant.
Actually, I've got one more question. But
yeah, go ahead. Yep. Go ahead. Yeah.
But if I've got too many, maybe too much. No. Is it okay?
Yes. So, what can I answer the first one first?
Yes.
And then,
yes,
if that's all right.
Sure.
Yeah. Just while it says.
Yes.
I think that's a really good question, and it's exactly why I didn't have to present this slide. Often people conduct research without thinking about how they are going to approach what they do. And I think you're right. You can say, and very often I have students and they say, right, I'm going to do an interview and I'm going to do a classroom observation. And I say, right, why are you going to do that? What's your research question? And they said that. And I said, right, well, why are you approaching that? What is it that you want to find out? Is it that you are interested in the everyday interactions between people? Or is it that you want to find out something else, that this particular instance that you're looking at is an example of something else? And that's what forces, I think, us to think about what is our approach to qualitative research. Can I take the example that you have? So you're looking at interactions between, or you've got one teacher and 3 students. You conduct interviews with them. So let me see, what is that? Is that action research? Is that case study? It's done over the internet. Is it internet-based research? Well, it could be any of those. Okay, it could be, if you're talking about interview methods, it could be any of those 3 that we've mentioned. It could also be naturalists. Sometimes it can be naturalistic if you're embedded within the particular environment. How do you define what your approach is? Because you need to identify what the focus of your research is. If you are interested in change, if you are conducting an interview with teachers because you want to implement some sort of change and you're going to do that in the classroom context, that would tend to me to be following more an action research process or approach. If, however, you have an interest in this particular interaction or this particular classroom that has this teacher and 3 students for whatever reason, say it's a group that has been withdrawn from a bigger class, and you want to focus on this one specific instance of this group working, that would seem to me that you're perhaps looking at something from a case study approach, because it's a specific instance of something else. When we think about naturalistic, is your research question driven about what is it that people do? Then that tends to push you towards a naturalistic approach, because understanding what people do is only really possible by looking at what it is that people do. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, Aisling. Yes, thank you very much.
So I
can conclude. So I can conclude that any of the types can include observation and interviews. So what best matches your, our research is just in according to the types when we research something or someone, which one. But like for example, like you said, we want to know the change, so it can be included in action research and other things. Is that am I concluding?
That's right. Yes. I mean, obviously, if we're talking about documentary research, we wouldn't normally have interviews in relation to documentary research. Sorry. But yes, no, absolutely. And it always goes back to what the focus of your research question is about. It's always about getting back to your research question and what particular approach is going to help you get the best answer or a best answer. Brilliant. Thank you. You had another question? Is that?
Maybe you can go on first. I'm afraid that I will interrupt your time. Yeah, maybe later if good.
Brilliant. Okay. And thank you very much. I'm sorry I can't see your image, but thank you very much. And I can't know what's your name. Just as I know.
It's Nining Aisling. Oh. Yeah, it's Nining. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Aisling. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thanks very much. Brilliant questions, and please don't be. I'm always really ashamed myself for not speaking Bahasan Indonesian, and I am just always delighted when people I can speak to people, and so so thank you very much for communicating with me, and I will, whatever way that you want to communicate, I'm really, really, really happy to respond. Okay. One of the other things I wanted to mention before looking at more detail about our research methods is the idea of research ethics. And I'm just raising this. I won't talk a lot about this. I just want to raise your awareness that before we would conduct any research, we would consider research ethics. There are many ways of explaining research ethics and understanding what concepts or ideas are included with that. And that's why I have suggested, I really like this diagram because it covers pretty much everything that you would ever want to think about in relation to ethics. Ethics, research ethics in the real world, this publication by Helen Cara, I think is a really useful one as well, because as you will know, research ethics can vary depending on the context or the geopolitical situation, location where the research is conducted. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. I also want to show you in relation to the context where I work. So these are British Educational Research Association ethical guidelines for research. So for example, the research that I do in the context in which I work in the UK are very much governed by these particular sets of guidelines. So the links are there for you to have a look at and to explore. And again, I really would encourage you to have these conversations with your teachers and your professors to find out about the research ethics, about the research practices within your own particular contexts, because I think that's really important. More universally speaking, or broadly speaking, we can use all these different terms to talk about research ethics, but the fundamental question that I always encourage researchers and myself to think about is, what impact am I having on the people who are engaged in this research? Okay, so that's the fundamental question. What kind of impact am I having on the participants because of me doing this research? So when I ask people to take part in an interview, what happens there? What's the impact? So I ask somebody to do something. What happens as a result of that? What's the impact of that on them? I ask people if I can observe their classrooms, which is often a bit of a scary one, you know. What happens? Can people freely say no? Can they say, no, thank you, Aisling, I don't want you to do that? What is it that I can do? So generally speaking, it is about the impact of the research on the researched, so on the research participants. But I encourage you, before you conduct any research, please have a look at reading about and thinking about and talking about the research ethics and practices in your own particular context as well. Okay, all right. Please remind me if I start to speak too quickly, please let me know. Please, Dr. Rennie, just say shh, slow down as well. Okay. Right. I've presented here some of the most common data collection methods that one would find in qualitative research. Interviews are one of the, it's already been mentioned, is one of the key ways of engaging with participants to ask questions, to find out about their experiences, to find about their perceptions, to find out about their values, all kinds of things that we might want to find out from and with a particular participant. Some of the information, or some of the articles that we looked at last week, were interviews between a researcher and a teacher. And that tends to be, I mean, if we're talking about educational research, that tends to be our dynamic. Of course, we have interviews that happen between researchers and students, and also interviews between parents, interviews between principals and other participants as well. Okay, so so we have interviews, we have focus groups, observations, and documentary analysis. So hello, can you hear me?
Hello, yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, all right, okay. Sorry, Dr. Benny, can I just 1 second, can I ask you as participants, can you think about the interviews, focus groups, observations and documentary analysis? And can you think of perhaps just one example, just 1 second, if that's okay? Can I just one short moment?
Yes. Sambil kita menunggu Ibu Aisling, mungkin ada yang akan ditanyakan, silakan dicatat, khususnya tentang cara mengambil data tadi ya, interview, focus group discussions, dokumen analisis, tadi satunya lagi apa tadi itu? Observations ya. Oke. Jadi yang ingin bertanya silakan nanti ditulis pertanyaannya di chat boleh atau di kertas masing-masing lalu nanti ditanyakan.
Hello, sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, so whoops, I'm on the wrong slide here. Okay, so interviews, focus groups, observations, and documentary analysis. So do any of you have some examples of where you have undertaken interviews or focus groups or observations or documentary analysis that you want to share?
Can I say something?
Yes, please, Benny.
Actually, I never conducted qualitative research, but I have ever once being with the participants of the research. And then, I think at the time, the researcher asked me to interview me, but I don't have any time, and I requested him to just jot down the questions, and I will follow up that questions in written form. So my question is it possible to have that? And then how we categorize that into this kind of data collection? Does it belong to interview or documentary analysis?
That's a really, really good question. Really good question. Obviously, that is that's a backup plan. So if something like that happens, which is not what the plan was. So the purpose of an interview is to interact with two people. Usually it's between an interviewer and an interviewee. It's to engage, it's to probe, it's to ask follow-up questions to what has been mentioned. So that's the purpose of the interview, to try to engage with a person. When we have it in written form, that's just a bit like a questionnaire. It becomes a bit like an open itemed questionnaire because there is no interaction. There's no space to clarify. There's no opportunity to ask for more detail or a further example. So I think as a backup, we know that things can go wrong, but it would always be I suppose the goal would always be to try to reschedule, if at all possible, the interview. That's always your goal, is to reschedule the interview, to have it on the phone if it's not possible in person, to conduct it online. But it is that same time, sharing same time and space and interaction. That is important. So that version would always be a kind of a backup. If that were to happen, you would have to take account for that in your reporting. So you would have to say, I conducted 6 interviews. I conducted a 7th interview, but it wasn't an interview. It was a question and answer conducted at different times, and it was conducted through writing. And so therefore you would have to then be aware of that, make that explicit within the report writing, but also think carefully about how you would be analysing that. Because that would be slightly different, because you may be able to code it in the same way if you're looking for content. So how many factual pieces of information. So how long has a person been a researcher or a teacher? Are they male? Are they female? How many years have they been working? What are their attitudes towards things that have been reported here? But in terms of of elaborating upon the reasons why perhaps one might think the way that one does. It's much more difficult to analyze that when it's just out in a non-dialogic occurrence, if you like. So it becomes more like the analysis of an open-ended questionnaire. That's how you would end up categorizing that data. That is how you would end up coding that data. Hello?
Yeah. So it can be categorized as an open-ended questionnaire then.
It could.
I see.
Yeah. If, however, I think it's a good question, Penny, because if, however, that was your plan from the start, if it was always going to be your plan from the start that you weren't going to conduct face-to-face interview, then you would look for another method. You wouldn't try to replicate something that's like an interview. You would be looking for another method. And that's where decisions around feasibility. So how feasible is this for me to conduct this particular type of research?
Actually, it was beyond the research plan, because at the time I was the participants and I was not really, because of language barrier, I feel a bit awkward to have like direct conversations with native speaker, and I'm afraid that I didn't get the point of the questions, and then I feel tense, the psychological factor. So I prefer, as a participant, to have like a written form of answers. It's easier for me to the questions and look at the meanings if I don't understand the words.
I mean, you raised two really, really important points there, Venny. Really important. One is that, and having worked and conducted research in different contexts, it is really important to take into account the participant. So one question that I would be asking would be, why is the interview conducted in a language in which it's not shared, or not always shared, or not comfortably shared between the participant and the interviewer? If that's the case, then why would you not use an interpreter as an example? So I think that has to be taken into consideration. The second matter is around, it's not a test, and I think for interview participants, sometimes it feels like a test. It's like, oh, I'm getting asked lots of questions, and therefore to minimize that, to minimize the sense that it is a test and it is more like a conversation. It's supposed to be more like a conversation than it is a test. Very often researchers will send the questions in advance. So participants can say, look, I'm a bit nervous. I am not really, I want to participate, but I'm not really sure about what you're going to ask. And a good researcher will say, here are the questions that I'm going to ask you. Now, they may not ask all of the questions. They might ask them in slightly different ways, but in general, they will follow, and I'll come to that in a minute. They will follow a schedule of questions, a series of questions that they want to ask. So a good researcher will try to make an interview participant feel at ease. Yes. To feel that it's not a test and it's not an exam. Because that's really not, it's really not. Because if you wanted to test them, make a test. If you want them to complete a questionnaire, give them a questionnaire. It is that straightforward. An interview is more akin to a conversation, and therefore it's all of those things about trying to engage people in what they think about things, why they think the way they do. Have they got examples of things that they think about? If you want to test them, give them a test. If you want them to write down written answers, give them an open-ended questionnaire. Thank you very much, Venny, because that raises those two really, really important points. So thank you very much.
Thank you too. There is this very clear answer. Thank you, Dr. Aisling.
Thank you. Okay. Just to mention some of we will be focusing on interviews as our sort of primary source of data here for the next in this session. But I want to point out different types of methods that are associated with qualitative research. Focus groups is another method. Sometimes they're referred to as group interviews, and that's where you can get people brought together, say a group of students or a group of teachers, to talk about a certain topic, and as the researcher you ask questions and you guide the discussion. So it's very much like a discussion group. Now, I suppose there's two slightly different perspectives. A group interview tends to be an individual interview asked at the same time to perhaps 3 or 4 different people. So it might be that the one question is asked to each person in the group, and that is kind of what a group interview would be like. A focus group is slightly different, and a focus group wants to try to get, well, what is there a collective view on a particular topic? Where and how are participants disagreeing or agreeing with one another? So in a focus group, it's very much trying to get at, what is the collective understanding? Is there a collective understanding? Rather than a group interview, which is very much, you know, you're kind of collecting 4 answers at the same time. Whereas in a focus group, it's very much trying to understand, do these people have a shared experience? Do they have similar or do they have different experiences of the same situation? So that's careful. Be careful in your terminology here, because there are differences in relation to either group interviews or focus groups. Observations we've talked a little bit about last week, but just to say that observations can, for example, people often think they can be, I observed a class for the whole day. Well, it might be the whole day, or it could just be one lesson. Or it could be 2 lessons by the same teacher, but given on different days. An observation can also be a specific part of a class. So thinking about your chemistry classes, you may have a particular focus on, no, I'm really interested. The only thing I want to observe is how they conduct the experiment. And so that might be just a part of a class that you want to observe, that you want to either record or that you want to look at. And you might want to look at that through a number of different groups. You know, so on Monday, you might want to observe group 1 doing the experiment. Tuesday is group 2 doing the same experiment, or whatever it is that it might be. So just to point out is that you need to set the limits of your observations. Okay. And documentary analysis, we talked a little bit about that, but just to say, in education research, it does cover things like lesson plans, you know, and looking at a lesson plan, it can be a very informative way of understanding what is the teacher's focus. In this lesson, what was the plan? What was the focus? What were the aims of the lesson? And very often, as we'll see towards the end, we do have some aims and we do have goals in our lessons, but sometimes what happens in real life looks a little bit different. And sometimes we want to investigate that as well. Okay. All right. So just to say, whoops, sorry. Okay, everybody still with me? Yes. Yes, okay, good, thank you. I see Dr. Ira nodding, and so I'll take that as a yes. Okay, good. Just to probe a little bit more into interviews, there are many different types of interviews, as there are many different types of questionnaires, as there are many different types of ways of observing. Dr. Ira, yes?
Ibu Ira, did you raise your hand?
Yes. I think I just unmute my mic, but it's also unmute. I'm sorry to interrupt to Dr. Aisling. I'm curious about the method that we are going to have when we want to make a data collection. Is it okay that we use only one method for searching the data? I think maybe I mean when we use the only one method, is it accepted in an article, in international article? Because I think there as an article that you are show us weeks ago. It's only use one method or another method gitu. Mungkin pertanyaan saya gitu Mbak Penny. Bisa nggak jelas? Boleh nggak sih kalau satu metode saja
Udah
dan kita
jelas kok.
gunakan? Sudah jelas ya?
Udah jelas tuh Mbak Ira ini campur-campurin ya.
Thank you.
Ibu Aisling, did you get the
Yes.
point? Okay.
Yes. Well, I think I got the point. I'll answer, and then you can tell me if I did understand. But yes, as I understand it, the question was around in qualitative research, is one method enough? Is the question? Is one method enough? It's a really, really good question. Yes is the short answer. Yes is the short answer. I think we had a similar conversation last week about how increasingly journals are trying to quantify qualitative research by insisting that there must be a minimum of 10 interviews. Now that kind of is a little odd in relation to qualitative research, because it's not about the number, it's about the quality. You could, let's take some very serious kind of examples. If you are conducting research on political leaders, for example, and you manage to get an interview with one very, very high profile world leader, are you going to be rejected because you haven't got 2 or 3 or 4 world leaders and their interviews? That's absurd. If someone has an interview with I won't name any world leaders because I'm really not sure about any of them. If you had one interview with a very significant person who could enlighten a phenomenon in a way that nothing else would, well, that would be more than acceptable. So it absolutely does come back to the focus of the research. Also thinking about, say, for example, very vulnerable groups, very marginalized groups, very difficult to reach groups. One interview or 2 or 3 interviews might be incredibly significant, and you might have had to work a long time to try to get those interviews. Yeah. So I think it's very much about the focus of the research. One of the conclusions I think that I reach at the end of this session is that it is very common that qualitative researchers use multiple data sources. And it kind of, in a way, it kind of goes a little bit against what I had mentioned there. Yeah. Part of it is about trying to capture what you can't always capture. You want to replicate what exactly happened in the chemistry experiment. You can record it, you can interview people, you can look at the lesson plans, you can give them questionnaires about, you try to capture something that has been quite a complex phenomenon to look at. And I think the more complex the phenomenon, the more we tend to want to look at multiple ways of analyzing and investigating that. So could there be a published paper with one interview? Yes, there could. Yes, there could. For the examples I've just given. Is it likely for one interview with one teacher to be published in a journal looking at assessment? I'm not so sure about that, because that's a fairly everyday occurrence, and it would need to be fully appreciated as to why is one interview with one teacher on a fairly everyday occurrence around assessment, for example, why is that going to offer insight into into understanding the phenomena? So so again, yes, it does. It does very much so refer to the focus and the research question. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Andrea. Again, really, you are all brilliant at asking questions. Can I just say that? No, you're all brilliant at asking questions. I really like that. Just
thank you.
Just to people will categorize different, and there are lots of different types of interviews, and I do encourage you to look at the different types of interviews. Broadly speaking, we can talk about them as being unstructured, structured and then kind of semi-structured. And really the very structured, so if we think about, you know, a continuum as very, very structured to the very, very unstructured. Now that doesn't mean that they're casual. It doesn't mean that they're not thought about beforehand. I suppose with a structured interview, it's very clear the questions are asked in a certain order. They tend to be asked in the same way to a range of different participants, and it's very clear what it is that is going to be asked and how it's going to be asked. With a semi-structured interview, you could have a set of questions, but the interviewer is free to either actually they've answered question 2 in their response to question 1, so I'm not going to ask question 2. So there is a bit of flexibility around whether or not to ask the question. There is also flexibility around your participant says something very interesting and you want to ask something else, a follow-up question, which isn't on your schedule to ask, but you know that it's important for your research to ask that question. Unstructured, there are lots of different types of unstructured interviews, and they are sometimes more associated with therapeutic interviews, in that they do have an aim and they do have a focus, but it can be very much led more by the participant than by the researcher. And that's where the idea of unstructured kind of it comes more from that sort of therapeutic, let the participant talk to you, let them tell you what it is that you know they want to tell you. Now obviously that's for your research question. If you have a specific research question that you want to find out, that you want to either confirm something or you want an example of something that has happened, you're clearly tending towards the more structured, you know, structured or semi-structured. You know, if it's unstructured, it seems to me to be a very exploratory piece, or it's something that you want that something has to come from the participant themselves without you having to put words in their mouth, if you like. So very different types of interviews there. But as I say, in the papers that we've looked at, very often it's semi-structured, but it is worth looking a bit closer at what exactly that might mean in terms of, is the order of questions going to be the same? Is the wording of questions going to be the same? Are the prompts there? And are they structured by topics, or are they structured chronologically? So worth having a look at those as well. I mentioned about focus groups. So the discussion group, bringing people together to find out their collective views and the interaction within the group. Observations. Now, we did mention observations last week, and it is an important area in relation to qualitative research. Many of those who write about research methods in education will want to make us aware of the different types of observations that we can do. And we also want to think of who is doing the observing, or what is doing the observing. And along the bottom here, I don't know, I hope you can see along the bottom here, we have different ways of undertaking our observations. So I suppose on the far end, we've got this woman here with the binoculars. So you're observing from a distance. That's the idea. You are a detached observer. So in a classroom context, this very often looks like the person who's sort of standing at the back of the class or sitting down at the back of the class. They're trying to make themselves look invisible. I always get the feel, when you're a detached observer, you want to be like wallpaper, or you want to be like a piece of the wall. You know, you're not participating. You want to disappear. You want the participants to act as if you didn't exist. And so that's very much, you don't want any of yourself having an influence on them. We move slightly along the decline here, the continuum, where the observer as participant. So that might be that rather than standing at the wall at the back of the class, you might take a seat beside one of the students in the class. you might not do anything, but you might become a little bit more participatory in the class. Participant as an observer, that then, you know, you're starting to look at what happens in the class. You're maybe you are, you know, touching some of the apparatus that's there. You are maybe answering a question, perhaps if the teacher is asking something like that. And then the other furthest, so the binoculars on one side and the touching the fish on the other, is really where you are a complete participant. You want to feel, experience what it is that the other participants are doing, that you want to engage with what they're doing. You want to feel that experience. So you become an active member of the setting that you're looking at. So you become a complete participant. You know, so if you think of those sort of that line, one is very far away with binoculars and the other is up close touching the fish and maybe feeding the fish, or, you know, whatever it is. So and again, observations can be for any period of time. They could be over a year. You could be doing observations for a year, you know, but over that period of time. Documentary analysis, we did mention about the different types of documents that you can analyze. One of the really one of the strong rationales for undertaking documentary analysis is making phenomena more visible. And by that, it might be, say we've got our example here of people looking through a textbook. And so one of the things that you might be interested in is maybe how men and women are represented in textbooks. You know, it could be a chemistry textbook, but that might be something that you're interested in looking at, or what countries, for example, are represented in textbooks about chemistry. And so that is one way in which the phenomenon that you're interested in, be it the kind of geopolitical representation of science, or be it about gender representations in textbooks, that actually makes it visible. And so when you do have documentary analysis, there can predominantly it's textual analysis, so you're analyzing text, but also it could be multimodal. So you may be looking at analyzing images that are presented in the documents. You may be looking at diagrams that are presented in documents. And certainly there's an increasing understanding of multimodal analysis. So being able to question, for example, you know, why is that diagram that color? What does the choice of color mean? When, you know, why have they chosen that color and not another color? Why have they, you know, why have these images been chosen? What do they want to represent? What do they want to show? What do they want to portray? So that's a little bit about that as well. Okay. Again, there's lots of words here, but I do want to kind of thinking about some of our advantages of particular methods and also some of the challenges about particular methods. Dr. Venny, you gave us some brilliant challenges for interviews. So participants who, you know, really feel uncomfortable, can feel uncomfortable being interviewed, and that perfectly legitimate, normal. I mean, why? An interview is an unusual thing. When you think of an interview, you sometimes think of a job interview, and that's like really high stakes. That's heart pounding and panic. You know, when we think of interview, equally so when we think about maybe going to the doctors as a bit of an interview, you know, going to talk to your boss as a bit of an interview. Interviews don't necessarily being involved in a police interview. These are kind of the notion of an interview, maybe a parent-teacher interview where the teacher calls you and says, come in, I need to talk about your children. Interviews can have a very sort of high stakes. They can have an impact on your participants. So it really is your responsibility as a researcher to minimize any of those negative impacts that your method might have on the participant. And that's what we're talking about there is ethics. That's ethics, about taking into consideration the impact of your research on the participants. Okay, so Anybody want to share some advantages of conducting interviews? So I've listed one here. This is not a full list. These are just some starters. So any advantages of doing interviews? Anybody like doing interviews? Maybe that might be.
Okay, anybody wants to answer? Ada yang mau jawab advantages and disadvantages? Is that are you asking advantages or disadvantages of interview?
Either. I was I started
Okay.
with I started with advantages, but I'm happy to hear any advantages or disadvantages, challenges of interviews. So Dr. Venny, you give us really good challenges, and that they are excellent. They are excellent challenges, yeah. And I prefer to think of them as challenges rather than disadvantages, because it makes us think about how we can overcome the challenges. You know, what can we do to make those challenges better, you know?
Yeah.
So
Pak Judianto, you unmute. It seems like you want to say something.
Yeah,
Please.
actually, I had experience conducting interviews. That can be a challenge for me, actually, how to keep on topic that you said in your slide, because one of my participants only short conversation, short answer. So how I manage to motivate, also to engage him or her to come out their views, also their thinking, something like that. So I think this is the challenge conducting interview. It's not, for some reasons, interview is easy, but for some reasons it's not. And it depends. That's why we have to think about our sample or our participants, yeah, who are going to interview, something like that. And actually, I had a question. Sorry, I think about you have explained about the type of qualitative study in the previous slide or in the beginning of our session today. Generally speaking, there are maybe I have read a Merriam book, a qualitative study. She categorized to be maybe 5: narrative, phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, or case study. And in my field, because my background in physics education, we seldom conducting something like phenomenology also and ethnography. We usually use narrative, case study, or grounded theory. How about if we don't mention our specific type of study? Just in our field, we say basic qualitative study. Can you say that? Because in our field, we didn't mention specific something like narrative, a case study. Can you say something like basic qualitative study?
Yeah, in some of the examples we used last week and some of the examples we look at this week, they don't specify what approach. So in published papers, they don't specify if they take a narrative approach, if they take a case study approach. They just go from the research topic to the method, and they kind of miss that. And that's you'll see that frequently happening. And I would tend to avoid the word basic qualitative. I would tend to avoid the word basic in anything, unless you know it's you know, because there is variety. I mean, to be honest, I'd avoid basic anyway, because a basic quantitative study, I'm not sure what that is either. You know, if it's but I think you just be confident about it's a piece of qualitative research, and I think when we want to make contributions to the field that is beyond what our answering of our research question, if we want to contribute to methodological discussions about how we understand the world, how it's best to conduct research in particular context, I think that's where it's vital to say what the approach is. I think if you want to engage with the discussion on research methods literature, I think if you want to engage with, look, my contribution is not just about I found out A, B, or C, but it's look at how I found out A, B, or C, and what does that tell us more about how we conduct research or how we have conceptualized the subject of or the phenomenon that we have done. I think that's where it's important. I think that's where it's important, and that's where that gets reflected in the journal articles. Who are very clear about their approach, is that they tend then, when you get to the contribution part of it, they are very clear. And arguably, that might be where there are what might be perceived as more higher quality, higher rated. Now, I know we can talk a long time about how articles are rated and things like that, but that might be where because you're engaging with a number of discussions at the same time. So that's I think where it becomes necessary, and I think it's not bad practice to think about that anyway. I think that would be my answer.
Yeah, I agree with that, because our colleagues, also probably PhD students, usually or often discuss about what type of your research design, something like qualitative, quantitative, mixed method, something like that. So it's very, it's very arguably. And I just remember my professor said that, don't worry about your type of your studies. Do you know what you are going to do? Or do you get like the contribution to your field or something like that? So, and the second one, sorry, the second one is, I want to know about the more specific, actually, case study. As far as I'm concerned, case study is that we want to know about specific case, for example, in our class. But currently, I have been reviewing one article, international, an article that is submitted in international journal, but I have not seen a case in their paper. It's like only description, like general description about in the class, general description in the classroom. So I don't think that I didn't see a case in their classroom. So maybe it's hard to categorize this a case. So how as a reviewer, I should say that okay, this article is good, but I didn't see a specific case in this article. Can I say that as a reviewer?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, one of the things, as you would to any student or you would to any colleague, to say, look, you need to be clearer in your in defining what your approach is. You need to be clear and at least explaining for your reading audience. You need to be clearer about what your approach has been. And if there's no information there, then it's kind of, I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing to ask for that information to be there. It shouldn't be up to the reader to try to work out, is this a case study or is this not a case study? So I think that is up to them and you as a reviewer to kind of say to them, please be explicit, because very often there can be reasons why people avoid that, is that they're not really sure if it's a case study. And I often think the omission is because they're not really sure either. And if they're not really sure, how am I going to work it out? It's not my research, right? So it's sometimes a difficult question to ask, because they go, I don't know what the answer is. And then they come back and they say, well, what is the answer? Is it a case study? And you go back and you say, how did you design this? What was your rationale for designing it the way that you did? And the thing about case studies is that case studies and yin is a really excellent reference for a case study. You probably know this, and talking about different types of, so looking at cross case comparisons, looking at multiple case studies. But at the core essence of a case is it's a specific issue and in depth, but it does say something about, it's not generalizable. But it does offer insight. That's the whole point about case study. You're looking at a specific issue, not just to investigate that specific issue, but for what does that lead us to say about other instances, which may or may not be similar, or which may or may not be different. in my field and around in case study of language learners, those have been some of the very most sort of influential pieces of research have been case studies of one learner, because they give us examples of things that we can then research further in other learners in lots and lots of different contexts. So, so although it is that specific instance, there is something about a case study that it has the power to speak to other instances, and to enlighten something for us as researchers about how they work. So, but yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
you're very welcome. Yeah, yeah, thank you. Brilliant. Okay, so interviews and advantages. One of the, I have to say, I completely, I understand. Some people may not like conducting interviews. Some people do not like having to interact with other people and asking them questions. And I think sometimes there is, you mentioned it, Joe or Cole, Joe, Dr. Joe, about Joe, okay, about the skilledness of the facilitator, because you've got this 45 minutes, this half an hour with this person. You want to get the most out of them, and then you get the participant who goes, yeah, no, I don't know, and you think, oh, this is rubbish, I can't use this, I can't use this interview. And so part of any structure of an interview is it very often begins with an introduction. And that's about trying to soften the difficulties, trying to establish relationships between the interviewer and the interviewee. It's trying to put people at their ease. And this can be difficult. You can think about instances where if you have, say, for example, a teacher who is interviewing a teenage student, there may be things that exist already within those two that they perhaps are not going to speak to each other. Whereas sometimes if you have someone who is from outside, an outsider who is not known to anybody, they come in and they're like, oh, who's that? They look funny, I'll have a chat with them. And so you want to think carefully about who is doing the interview and their skilled interactive skills. Now, we all have bad interviews is the other thing. Just because one interview goes like yes, no, that those things always happen. And there's, I think the worst thing is to get frustrated by them and to get annoyed. It just happened, and you just maybe have to do another interview with, a similar kind of participant. But it is something that practice, I think, and that's where very often in any study we might be talking about piloting interviews, not only just to pilot the questions that are asked and how they're asked, but also to give the researcher a bit of practice in knowing how to ask, how to encourage people, how to appear that you're listening. And that's, I think, one of the most important things for new researchers to learn about, is to show that you're listening. So in discourse analysis, we talk about listenership and listenership tokens, and showing people that you're listening and that you want them to continue. And very often, when people start to talk, people maybe nod. They say things like that. They don't say any words, but they continue. They encourage the continuation. So those kinds of listenership tokens, signaling listenership, is important. But those are certainly, in terms of time, that's one of the advantages about interview, is you get a lot of information in a relatively short amount of time. So within 45 minutes, you have got a considerable amount of data. Whereas if you think about in a questionnaire, how long you've had to prepare the questionnaire, you still have to prepare interview questions, but there's something that, that can take a bit longer as well. Thinking about sort of the focus groups, there are pluses and minuses, there are advantages and challenges as well. I think certainly within focus groups, the skill of the interviewer is important to keep people on topic. to keep people from arguing too much. You know, I think that's important in focus groups. But again, you have the advantage of getting numerous views all at the same time in the same 45 minutes. You know, so there is something about that. So, and we always have to bear in mind that research projects are finite. They have a beginning and they always have an end. So the research can't go on forever. So it is important that you can manage the number of interviews, that you can manage the number of participants that there are for your project. Observations, certainly the advantage of observation is capturing the naturalistic context, capturing what actually happens. Interviews are always about reports of what happened. So they're always seen through the participant's lens. It's always through their perspective. And that is what you want. That's the point of an interview. But if you're thinking about an interview as fact giving, you need to be cautious about that, because those are going to be self-reported, if you like. Whereas observations, they capture what happens. One of the things we'll see, hopefully, if I don't run out of time, is, you know, we can ask teachers, what do you do in classrooms in an interview? And teachers tell you, I do this, and I do this. Then you turn up in the classroom, you turn on the video camera and you observe, and they do not do this, this, and this. They do this, this, and this, you know, and that's not, please be clear, they are not lying. They are not presenting an untruth. That is just how the participant sees the world. So the teacher is saying, oh no, I am doing this, this, and this. But when we capture it from a different perspective, it doesn't look like that. So that's why observations are important. However, the downside of observations, and I'm sure, please feel free if anybody wants to talk about the downside of observations. It can be a big imposition. This can be a big request. You want to come into my class? Oh no. You want to come in with a video recorder? Oh no, that's even worse. You know, I'm going to look stupid. You know, you're going to criticize my teaching. You're going to pick up on all my bad faults. You know, and that requires an element of trust, and it also requires an element of transparency. So to be really, really transparent about, why are you coming into my class? What are you looking for? What data are you going to be collecting? And how are you going to be analysing it? And those are legitimate questions for any participant to ask you as a researcher. You should be able to give those straight away. You know, why are you in here? What are you looking for? How are you going to analyse this? And how is this going to be reported? You know, those are brilliant questions, because if you have answers to those questions straight away, it means that you've thought about your research ethics. You know your research question, you know why you've chosen the methods that you have. And so those are good questions to be asked. And we should encourage and enable participants to feel free to ask those questions. You know, we know that, you know, university researchers are seen as somewhat, you know, in a position of power, in a position of prestige. And so it may be a position where teachers can't feel they can say no. And that's not right. You know, we need to be able to be clear about what's possible. Okay, just one final point about Venny, you're making me talk about the pros and cons. I wanted to talk about the advantages and the challenges, but I think you've made it clear it's pro. No, thank you for that. That's good. Documentary analysis. Do you know, it's sometimes a lot easier to collect documents than it is to invite a participant to take part in an interview, to set up a room, to set up recording, to transcribe, to all of the things associated with interviews. And, you know, opening a book or printing off is a lot easier, and it is. That's be satisfied. That is easy. That is an advantage. They are relatively easy to access. Now, again, it depends on what document that that you're looking at, but public domain data around curricula, around textbooks, they're easy to access. There is also a publication date and author. So there tends to be some contextual information around that. And they also serve as a record of the phenomenon. You know, they're there as proof, if you like. They are the evidence that, you know, this is the curriculum, this is the lesson plan. So they afford that kind of evidence. The downside, of course, to that is that although there may be a publication date, there may be no indication of who produced the document that you're looking at. It might have been produced by many people, and it might have been revised a number of times. So you've no real indication of who the actual author is. And if that's important, then you've lost that as well. So there can be a little bit of a lack of context, and also about why they are produced. Sometimes that can be difficult to uncover. You know, with a curriculum document, why were they produced? Well, it might have been in response to a change in the curriculum. It might have been in response to teachers seeking advice on how to deliver particular topics. You know, that might not always be entirely clear. And that's one of the things around documentary analysis, that you would be collecting, asking yourself lots of questions about the document that you're intending to analyze. Okay, all right. I'm going to move on now, if that's okay. Is that all right? Benny's saying yes. Oh, sorry. Please go ahead, Maria.
Okay, Dr. Aisling, I want to ask you about my research now. My topic is analysis of misconceptions that using multiple choice tests to tier. The first tier is multiple choice, and the second is open-ended reason. So can I namely that qualitative or not, or just descriptive?
Okay, so
okay. The second question is if I have a transcript of the answer, maybe student ujian apa sih?
Examinations.
Okay. I'm sorry, pardon my English, Dr. Aisling.
I think we've had the discussion about my behalf in indeed.
Okay, transcript of examination. Can I apakah kita bisa menjadikan itu sebuah artikel dan itu sebagai kualitatif riset gitu, Bu?
Oh, ibu mau menganalisa hasil ujiannya itu ya?
Misalnya ini pertanyaan kedua yang berbeda ya, Bu ya. Misalnya kita punya hasil ujian mahasiswa gitu kan. Apakah ini dengan metode documentary analysis ini bisa juga menjadi sebuah penelitian kualitatif?
Oke. Itu pertanyaannya terbuka berarti Ibu ya, hasil ujiannya itu ya?
Yeah.
Okay. Ibu Aisling, Ibu Maria Ulfa asked you whether we as a researcher can use the document of the final exam, for example, to analyze we analyze that as a document analysis. That's the question.
Yes, is the short answer. Yes. So this is an exam that has already been prepared by somebody else and it's just being done, and you want to analyze how they've answered the questions, or you want to analyze the exam itself, or both of those?
Pardon, Ibu Aisling, can you repeat?
Sorry, I beg your pardon. So yes is the short answer to the documentary analysis. My question is it an analysis of the test itself, or is it an analysis of how the student answered the test?
Oke, Ibu Maria Alfa, apakah ini tesnya ini menganalisa tes itu sendiri atau menganalisa bagaimana murid itu menjawab tes itu?
Menganalisa tes itu sendiri, Bu.
Oh, jadi menganalisa tes. Ibu Aisling, Bu Maria said it's about analyzing the task itself.
Quant kayaknya itu.
That's very. Oh, sorry. Yeah, That's, I mean, I was asking that question for interest because I'm really in, yeah, that's either is documentary, either you can look at it because you're collecting up documentary evidence from that naturalistic setting. That's really interesting to do analytical work on exams, on tests, on how they're structured and what they contain. Yeah, that's really interesting. Mm-hmm.
So do you think this is quantitative or qualitative if we want to assess the tasks of the students itself? Is that the result? Ibu Maria itu hasilnya kah? Hasil tes kan, Bu?
Iya, Bu. Jadi misalkan kita...
Misalnya gimana contohnya?
Iya, jadi untuk yang pertanyaan pertama tadi belum dijawab ya, Bu ya, yang to tire itu.
Apa tuh pertanyaan Mbak tuh? Coba Ibu ulangi pertanyaannya.
Mohon maaf ya.
Nah,
jadi misalkan gini, kita punya soal to tire pertama itu kan pilihan ganda, soal pilihan ganda, kemudian tire kedua itu mereka diminta untuk memberikan alasan dari pilihan jawabannya. Nah, alasannya ini terbuka, Bu. Nah, jadi kemudian ya kita tidak menginterpretasikan ke dalam angka gitu kan nilai, tetapi kita menganalisis dari alasan yang diberikan. Ini soal pertanyaan saya yang pertama, Bu.
Oh, jadi bagaimana
itu bisa juga termasuk kualitatif atau tidak kan?
Oh, gitu. Bagaimana jadi Ibu mau mengkategorikan jawaban mereka ya?
Iya.
Ibu Aisling, Ibu Marilva asks you if there is like a task. So the test has like two kinds of responses. The first one is multiple choice, and then the second response that the student should answer is about the open-ending questions. Why he answered that. So Ibu Marilva asking whether it can be categorized as a qualitative research, because Ibu Marilva wants to analyze the second open-ended answer.
Yeah, that has to be, you can, yes, that's, don't forget we have mixed methods research. I suppose that's one of the things, the things that, you know, that I mean, one of the really important things about that kind of documentary analysis is being able to establish what your framework for analysis is before you begin the test. So it might be that you decide that you're going to look at the number of multiple choice tests, or you're going to be looking at, you know, the composition of those tests, but you might also want to be looking at the more open-ended, you know, science, they have to describe, you know, how things are, provide definitions, and that's only possible through qualitative analysis. So if you're remember what we said about qualitative analysis, so it's getting about the quality, being able to describe the particular features of the answer or of the test. So when it's qualitative data, you'll be doing qualitative, you know, you can use mixed methods, and that's something that we probably haven't. Maybe that should be in our next session, Benny. But yeah, we can use that. But I think when we're looking at the quality of a text or the quality of something, then it will be qualitative research. You have to, if there is a level of interpretation that you have to conduct, then that will inevitably be around qualitative research. But remember, of course, we can count things, like we've got observations here, for example, but we could count the number of times the teacher asks a question. We could quantify some of the data that we're capturing here. But I suppose mixed methods is always your sort of your safest bet, because if you're wanting to use quantitative data to describe like how many questions there were, but then your qualitative elements, well, what kind of questions were they? You know, so it's always that how many and what kind. And yes, mixed methods is much more accepted, I think, than it had been in the past. And yeah, so you just describe it as accurately as you can. I think the best thing to do is, sometimes people can get in a bit of a confusion about, oh, is this a case study? Is it action research? You know, or is this qualitative research? Think back to what you're doing. Always think back to what you're doing. What am I doing with this data? Am I counting how many times something has happened? Well, then I'm doing some quantitative work. It might be descriptive. It might not necessarily be statistical, that you're going to conduct, you know, statistical tests on, but it might be descriptive. You might be using numbers to describe frequency. And so, you know, you happily use mixed methods, but be clear. That's the important thing, is don't try to pass off quantitative stuff as qualitative. Just be really transparent. Just be really open and say, you know, I counted how many things there were here because I wanted to describe, you know, how many multiple choice answers there were, or whatever it is. Maria, does that answer your question? I'm not sure if it does.
Gimana Bu Maria? Jadi kata Ibu Aisling tadi tuh kalau misalnya itu
mixed method ya Bu ya?
Ya mix. Kalau yang pertama kan pertanyaannya berapa banyak itu. Dan terus yang kedua tuh jenis seperti apa sih jawaban mereka, kan yang Bu Maria mau pengen execute kan. Nah itu lebih ke kualitatif. Jadi bisa di situ. Iya.
Maybe can I add something? Maybe you're
freezing Pak Jo. I think something wrong with your internet connection.
Bu Feni.
Iya.
Nah, jadi sebenarnya saya tidak menilai membuat skor terhadap hasil tesnya, tapi langsung ke analisis alasannya saja.
Oh,
gitu
berarti kualitatif lah kalau kayak gitu.
Ya, berarti bisa ya masuk.
Iya, itu ya tadi Ibu Aisling jawab. Oke, gitu.
Tapi kalau memang kita deskripsi keduanya berarti masuk method ya.
Kalau Ibu juga yang ngambil yang pertama tadi, yang multiple choice tadi kan mau dihitung kan. Gitu. Oke.
Terima kasih Bu Feni. Thank you, Dr. Aisling.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria. Good questions. Thank you. That's really good. Brilliant. Benny, I'm conscious that we've got, is it just 5 minutes left? Is that right?
That's right. Yes, 5 minutes left. Ibu Aisling,
yes.
Will you explain about data analysis today or next sessions?
That's just what I was going to ask. I've ran out of time. I don't want to rush to do the analysis. I don't, because I want us to do this together. So if I can.
Because that's the most important part, I guess, about the data, how we analyze the data.
Yeah.
Or maybe we have it next sessions, perhaps. You have 5 minutes left. Or maybe you want to show us at glance, perhaps. This up to you.
I'll if that's okay with you, I will. Yeah, I just want to prepare you for our session. It's Thursday, the session. Okay, isn't that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's Thursday session.
Yes. So I'll I just want to prepare you a little bit for that.
Yeah.
And if you want to do some reading in advance of that, or I don't know if that's possible within the day, that might not be. Okay, I'll leave that. Okay. Just to prepare, just to, I want to show you, I just want to prepare you in the last few minutes for what we're going to do on Thursday. And before we get to Thursday, if you want to think about ways in which that you can begin to think about coding and categorizing and making sense of interviews. So you've got your interview transcript, and what do you do with it? And so that's really what I wanted to go through with some examples. But in preparation for that, so that's what we'll be doing on Thursday, and then I'll put on the bit for the publication writing. I'll add that on to the end, and we'll try and get through that as much as we can. I want to just to think about, this is a very famous sort of so Kveil, very famous reference here in relation to conducting interviews, and I'm using this as kind of the baseline of kind of qualitative data, qualitative textual data, and he goes through these different stages of designing interviews and the process of interviews. And I want to take these sort of a little bit step by step. We've, in some of the questions that Dr. Ira has asked and Maria has asked as well, my answers have maybe not been yes or no. They've been, it depends on the research question, it depends on the topic. And that's what this part is about, the thematizing. It's about what is the content of the thing that you're looking at? What is it about? You know, is it about assessment? Is it about teaching techniques for, I forgot what the word was, tritation, whatever it is, the chemistry experiment. So this thematizing is really about thinking about what are the core issues, what are the ideas that you want to investigate. And then from that, you then begin to design and pull out some questions that you might want to ask a teacher. So if you're interested in, you know, how do teachers respond to incorrect questions from students, you might want to think about, well, what would we ask a teacher? We might ask the teacher, what do you do? If a student gives you an incorrect answer, what do you do? So that might be one of our questions. Another question might be, why do you think that's the best way to do that? Another one might be, can you give me an example of a time when you had to correct a student? So those are the kinds of questions that we would be talking about. Then in relation to the interview, your colleague, Dr. Joe, was very clear about, and Vinny yourself was very clear about some of the problems and challenges of conducting interviews, and that cannot be underestimated. It is not straightforward and easy always to conduct an interview. Okay, you know, from both sides, from both the participant side, but also from the interviewer side. You know, sometimes as an interviewer, you can get very nervous about having to interview, say, a principal of a school, or interview a parent, or even interview a young person. You can get nervous about that. So there are many different aspects of interviewing that we need to be conscious of. One of the big, people forget about it, and it annoys me, but that's me, is about how we take the audio recording of an interview and put it into written form. Now, that is a level of interpretation, okay? And depending on what transcription system you use, data will be missed, data will become the focus. So there are things that you miss depending on the transcription system that you use. I know that sounds very, very, very detailed, but it is really important to recognize that in transcribing, you change from capturing an audio experience, and you change it into written form. And so in a way, sometimes when we listen to audio, we re-experience being in the room, listening to people talking. However, when we read a transcript, we sometimes are a bit more distant from it. It's a bit like the woman with the binoculars and then the little boy feeling the fish. All right. When we listen to it, we are the little boy with the fish. When we read it, we're a bit more like the woman with the binoculars. Okay, so we need to recognize that. And so we lose things. When you're very far away, you can lose some of the qualities that are there. So that's really important. Okay, then we'll talk about analyzing. There are loads of different ways of analyzing, and there's no right way of analyzing. The key aspects are to be rigorous and transparent. And that's really important. Rigorous means that you be consistent. You do on one interview what you've done on another interview and another interview. To be transparent is that you write down exactly what procedures that you used to look at the interview transcript. This verifying and reporting, they're, I suppose, a bit more transactional, a little bit. So I'm going to stop talking because I think it's way over. I've gone over my 5 minutes, Fanny, but that's what I want you to think about. I want you to think about the transcription, and I want you to think about the analysis. So imagine you've done all some of the hard stuff about, you've conducted an interview. It was great. People talked. It was very good. Now, how do you transcribe and how do you analyze? And so those are the things that I want us to have a good look at then on Thursday. So straight away, we'll start on Thursday, if that's okay, with our looking at transcription and analysis. And hopefully then by the end, we'll be a lot happier, I think, with our analysis. And we'll take maybe the last sort of 20 minutes of Thursday session to look at the engaging with publication and reporting. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Aisling, for very engaging explanations about qualitative research methods. This is like dangling, because we haven't got about data analysis yet. However, this is really good to engage the participants to join our discussions for next sessions on Thursday. Everyone, don't forget that we are going to have the last session with Dr. Aisling on the 24th of November at the same time. Okay, Dr. Aisling and ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your participation. See you next on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye,
much.
everyone.
Thank you. Take care. See you Thursday. Bye-bye.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you.
Bye-bye.